Good afternoon or evening, depending on when you're watching this. My name is Blane Harding, and Monica Lee was gracious enough to invite me back. I think I was there probably 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, and she asked me to do another recording. So this is our opportunity for round two, I guess. She gave me the charge of actually talking about not only diversity and inclusion, but just as importantly, talking about the bias and the bias that we may hold and the bias that we may have, because we all have bias. Sometimes people are afraid to admit it. Sometimes they're ashamed of it, but we do indeed have bias. And I'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. So I'll be pulling up a PowerPoint in just a second for all of you to watch, but I want you all to understand too that I'm always available. You can always email me. You can always contact me. I'm going to send the PowerPoint to Monica so that she can actually give it to everybody. In the very last slide of the PowerPoint, we'll have my contact information, and it's just blaineharding22@gmail.com. So if anything comes up or there's aspects that I speak about over the next 60 minutes or so that you want further details on, please feel free to just contact me. This is a topic that I think is really germane. It's a topic that's really important to mentors, not just in terms of the bias or microaggressions, but I think diversity is just as important. And when I define diversity very broadly. So I'm not just talking about racial or ethnic diversity. I'm talking about diversity of all kinds. I'm talking about religion and spirituality. I'm talking about rural and urban. I'm talking about social economic status. I'm talking about gender identity and sexual orientation. And I know you're working with younger kids as well in terms of your mentoring, and I really appreciate the job that you all are doing because it's not easy to mentor people. It's not easy at all, but you also have to understand that it doesn't matter what age they are, they all have the identities that I just mentioned. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of not just their primary identities, but also their secondary identities. So I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. I'll begin the conversation, and then at the end, I'll have some remarks as well. But before I get started, I think there's just some basic rules that you have to understand if you're going to actually really become culturally competent or culturally effective. I think the number one rule, and the thing that I always tell people, is you have to treat the individual within a cultural context. I think that's extremely important. Very oftentimes, we treat people as ethnic beings. And there's a number of people that don't identify the way they look. I've been accused of being almost all kinds of different identities, from Middle Eastern to Latino to Black to everything, because people are always making assumptions. And we want to make sure we're not making assumptions about people's identity. So you treat the individual within a cultural context. Once you get to know that individual, then you'll find out how they identify. Then you'll know whether or not you need to take it to that next step and be able to understand their culture and their background. And it's not always about culture. We'll find that out over the next 60 minutes, because sometimes there's things that are even more important than culture. But we always talk about cultural aspects and cultural effectiveness and cultural competencies. So once again, the number one rule is you treat the individual within a cultural context. Everybody identifies the way that they look. Number two is you don't have to accept everything about everybody's culture. And I know people have been taught that, and I understand that, but there's a variety of different things that we all can't accept, whether it's how they treat women, whether it's how they treat the elderly, whether it's female circumcision. There's so many different aspects of people's identity that we just can't accept. We don't have to accept every aspect of their culture, but we do have to accept them as individuals. We've got to give them the respect and the dignity that they deserve, regardless of what their culture is, even regardless of what age they are. We need to have them respect and dignity from kids in K through 12 just as much as we have respect and dignity for our colleagues or for the people that are in college. So just wanted to lay down some foundation so you understand where I'm coming from. So give me 1 second, and I'm going to pull this PowerPoint up, and then we can actually have a conversation and discussion about that. So to begin with, when you actually take a look at these aspects and you take a look at what's going on, I think one of the most important things to understand is what John Gardner said. We have tried everything under the sun to improve student success. And I mean everything. We've tried everything from mentoring to tutoring to counseling to the writing center to having students do extra work. We have to understand that there's really no magic bullet. Everybody's drinking the Kool-Aid for this or that, but we have to understand that we really have to understand those student experiences. We really have to understand how those students are learning, where those students are coming from, what their backgrounds are. I think one of the most important aspects of being a mentor and being a coach and being a role model for students is getting to know their culture, of course, because that's what we're talking about today. But I would think what's even more important is getting to understand their lived experiences. We want to make sure we understand those lived experiences because it's those lived experiences that really identify them as individuals. My lived experience as an African-American and Italian African-American, because my grandmother's name is Santina Angelina Vigliotti, and it doesn't get any more Italian than that. Living and being raised in upstate New York is far different than where I'm at now. I'm in Southwest Virginia. And just prior to this, I was in Nevada. And prior to that, I was in Kansas. And African-Americans, all of those areas are different. That's why it's so important to understand their lived experiences before you actually begin to understand other aspects of who they are. So once again, the initiatives are the periphery of student experiences. It's the relationships that we build that are extremely important. And I know you all understand that because you're mentors. If you don't have a solid relationship with your mentees, then you're probably not going to be successful. So we've got to make sure that we're not only gaining that relationship, we have to make sure that we're maintaining that relationship over time, because it's really important to their success. And it's also important to our success as mentors to guide them, to coach them, and to role model for them. So we also have to understand there's three areas that I think are really important, especially as mentors. And once again, it's irregardless of who you're mentoring in terms of age. We sometimes don't give young people enough credit. And if we don't plant the seed where they're young, very oftentimes when they come to college, they think they know it all. They think they're already set. They think that they can't learn anything except for what's in the classroom. And college is more than that. Education is more than that. Whether you're in fourth grade or fifth grade or ninth grade or 10th grade, education is so important in molding people to understand not only the disciplines that we're teaching them, but just as important to understand what their role is, what their obligations are, what their duties are as citizens in this country. And one of their duties is to make sure that they're using their influence, they're using their power that doesn't disadvantage anyone. You know, young people, they have influence as well. They have influence over their peers. We sometimes call that peer pressure. They have influence to conduct themselves in a certain way, but we've got to make sure that we're educating them at that age so that they understand that. So they understand what their role is. They understand that they're playing a role regardless of that. And young people will get this. Young people, I don't care what the age they are, they will get this. If they can learn biology and they can learn chemistry, then they can learn what their role is as citizens. I think the other thing that becomes extremely important is that they have to develop values. In developing values at a very young age, all of you understand that as mentors, how critical and crucial that is. In personal qualities that produce a new generation of citizens. You can take a look at what's happening in the country today. You can take a look at what's happening politically and socially, and even on our streets. We've got to make sure that this next generation are prepared for it. We have to make sure that they understand that society has to be just and that society has to be equitable. And as mentors, you teach that. I know you're mentoring certain topics and certain subjects, but you're also mentoring individuals. You're also mentoring young children and young children who can be molded. Not that we want to convince them that we're right and they're wrong. That's not what I'm saying, but we want them to think. I think that's what our job is. Our job is to get them to think, not necessarily to tell them what to do and how to do it. So we've got to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're instilling in them the ability to reason. We always talk about that in higher education. You know, one of the things that we want to make sure that all of our students graduate with is critical thinking skills. Young people also have critical thinking skills. Young people also have the ability to reason. They also have the ability to question. They also have the ability, especially at that age, to develop good character. And if you're going to tell me that you have good character and you don't believe in equity, I would push back on that and say that you don't have good character. How could you have good character and not believe in fairness? They are not separate issues. They are not mutually exclusive. And we have the opportunity when we're working with young kids, when we're working with young people, to actually instill these concepts in them so that they can begin to understand it. They may not fully understand it at that age, but at least we're planting that seed. So as they move forward, it develops, and it develops in a way that's going to be positive. Just think, we are socialized. We're socialized from the day that we're born. We're socialized to believe certain things. We're socialized to do certain things. We're socialized to act in certain ways. Why can't we socialize this as well? It's really no different when it comes down to it. And lastly, develop those qualities to address structural problems. They're not going to be able to address structural problems at their age, even though they do have a degree of influence, even though they do have a degree of privilege. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that they're going to make changes in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade, and they can. They can as they move forward. But unless we instill this in them, unless we talk about that as being part of their responsibility, and I don't think that we want them. What I think is that we need them. And there's a big difference between wanting and needing. We need them to move forward, need them to understand these concepts. We need them to be part of that change just as much as we need anything else, because they are the next generation of leaders. They are the next generation that's going to push things forward. So why not socialize them at this age to make sure they understand that, and to make sure that they understand that they also have to be culturally effective, that they also have to have the ability to get along with people that are different than themselves. And very oftentimes, when you take a look at the way our society is, I don't know anybody that would argue that we do not live in a multicultural, diverse society. I think that is a given. But very oftentimes, we live in a multicultural, diverse society that is actually segregated by race and class. So oftentimes, young people don't even come into contact with many other people that are different than themselves, at least outwardly, physically different than themselves. And that's how most people look at diversity. They look at it in terms of physical presence and what you look like, even though we know diversity is much deeper than that. So we've got to make sure that they understand that this is the time for them to actually become comfortable being uncomfortable. This is the time for them to get to know other people outside of the people that look like themselves. They shouldn't be waiting until they get out of high school. They shouldn't be waiting until they go to college. They shouldn't be waiting until they leave their neighborhoods. Even if they don't know many people that look like themselves, that don't look like themselves, that doesn't mean that they can't develop the skills that are necessary to interact with those individuals. The openness that's necessary, the acceptance that's necessary, the ability to question that's necessary. All of these things are important if we actually want the next generation that's coming forward not to have to go through some of the things that our generation or your generation has actually gone through. So cultural competency refers to knowledge, skills, awareness, cultural differences, and similarities with, among, and between groups. It is really important for you as mentors to understand this. It's really important for you as mentors to develop your cultural competency. And once again, I'm not simply talking about race. I'm not simply talking about ethnicity. I'm not simply talking about gender. I'm talking about all forms of diversity. We've got to make sure that as professionals in our professional practice, that we're putting these things in place, that we can translate this competency into action. There are a lot of people that understand diversity. There's a lot of people, if you give them an exam, they'll get a great grade on it. But then when you tell them, go and apply this, go and leverage it, they have no idea how to actually do that. So we want to make sure that they have the ability to leverage this cultural competency. They have the ability to interact with people that are different than themselves. They have the ability to mentor people that are different than themselves. I now work at Virginia Tech. This is the fourth institution that I've worked at, and I've been a director at every institution that I've been at: Colorado State, University of Nevada, Reno, University of Kansas, and now Virginia Tech. Every single group of individuals that I have ever supervised, I have one rule for them. You have to go out and you have to serve as an advisor for a group that is not part of your own identity. So if you're an African American, you cannot serve as an advisor, and you cannot serve as a faculty advisor for the Black Student Organization. Find out somebody else, work with another group, expand that comfort zone so that you're beginning to relate to a wide variety of people. I firmly do not believe it when people tell me that you have to look like somebody in order to mentor them. I would rather have somebody that cares. I would have somebody that's concerned. I'd rather have somebody that has a high degree of cultural competence, cultural effectiveness to mentor my 4 children than simply somebody that looks like them. You've got to care. You've got to have empathy. You've got to have compassion. You've got to have the ability to forgive. You've got to have the ability to have grace. Those are the things that are really important for anybody to be an effective mentor. This is the best definition of cultural effectiveness I have ever seen. And take a look at what it says in that very first line. To be culturally effective doesn't mean you are an authority in the values and beliefs of every culture. That's not cultural effectiveness. 4 aspects. Number 1, you've got to have respect. I guarantee you, every single one of you knows Aretha Franklin's R-E-S-P-E-C-T song. I've yet to meet anybody in my 31 years in higher education that I've given presentations to that have not heard that song. I also haven't met anybody that knows the words beyond the first line, but that's another story. But respect is really important. You've got to understand that you have to have respect for them. You have to understand that you're eager to learn. No matter what age group you are mentoring, you can learn from them. And I think it's important that you understand that. You are mentoring them, but it's not just a mentor-mentee, it's also a mentee-mentor. There's so many things that we can learn from the people that we're mentoring, especially in terms of their backgrounds, especially in terms of their experiences, especially in terms of how they actually view the world. We've got to be open to that. I came home for a presentation one year, and my son, who's now 26, was 17 years old. And I came into the house and he said, "Dad, how'd your presentation go?" And I said, "It was awesome. I blew him out of the water." My son looked at me and he said this: "Do you realize that overconfidence is the alcohol of the fool?" I learned from him that day, and I will never, ever say I blew anybody out of the water again, because I had that openness to learn from somebody who was 17 years old and actually told me what I should be thinking. So it's respect, it's eagerness to learn, it's willingness to accept. And as I said earlier, it's not necessarily accepting every aspect of their culture. It's accepting them as individuals, getting to learn their culture over time, but accepting them as individuals. And the fourth one, you have to be understanding that your worldview is not the only worldview. And I think that's really important. When I usually talk about worldviews, automatically people go to the international level. There are different worldviews within groups in the United States. We are a huge country of over 390 million people. There's a vast difference between the Northeast and the Southeast and the Northwest and the Southeast and the Midwest. There are so many different worldviews in this country. We have to understand that our worldview, especially in our generation, we all belong to a different generation. That's not the same worldview as the generations that are actually coming up now. Get to understand them, get to know where they're coming from, get to know how they reason. And that's how you're going to be an effective mentor, by actually getting to know them and getting to know where they're coming from. Respect, eagerness to learn, willingness to accept them as individuals, and understanding our worldview is not the only worldview. Those are the keys to becoming culturally effective. And also we have to provide this path. And we've been doing this for a long time, especially in higher education. We've been trying to figure out, okay, what's the path to student success? What's the path to us putting them on a level so that they can be successful? And the first thing we have to understand is they have to define what success is. We don't define success for them. And we try to build that, we try to plant that seed, and we try to encourage them to do the very best that they can and to thrive for as much as they possibly can. But it's up to them to define over time what success means for them. We've got to make sure that we understand that. We've got to make sure that we also understand their lived experience, because that's the true path to student success. How can you mentor somebody if you don't know their lived experience? How can you mentor somebody if you don't know what they're going through? How can you mentor and coach somebody and give them suggestions of how they can improve if you don't understand what those lived experiences are? You have to. And it requires us to build strong relationships. And you all understand that. You've mentored, and if you haven't mentored, you know what mentoring is. Mentoring is built off of relationships, and strong relationships, relationships that we build with the students that we're actually serving. Muhammad Ali once said this: "Service to others is the rent we pay for our time here on earth." We make sure that we serve them to the best of our abilities. We make sure that we put everything in to what we need to do in order for them to be successful. Paulo Freire once said this, and you can just read that for yourself. I think the key is the very bottom of that page. "I can in no way underestimate such knowledge, but what is worse, to ridicule it." The students that we're mentoring bring their baggage with them. It's basically what this is saying. They bring their baggage with them. They bring the baggage of their life experiences, regardless of how old they are, regardless of what they've been or where they've been or how often they've been out of their neighborhood. We have to make sure we understand that. They don't leave it at the door. All of that is part of it. All of that is what we're talking about. All of that is the way we're going to shape and we're going to change the students that we're serving. So we need to make sure that we're doing that. We need to make sure that we understand that, or else we're going to lose the students. We're going to lose them because we can't relate to them. We're going to lose them because we can't understand them. We're going to lose them because we don't allow them to tell their story. Everybody wants to tell their story. Give your students the opportunity to tell their story. Tell their story in the way that they want to tell it, and including the things that they want to include, because I think it's important. And once you've got a solid relationship with students, they will open up to you. They will tell their story. They will let you know what they need. But we've got to make sure that they understand that we want to listen to them. We don't just want to tell them what to do. We want to listen to them. We want to pay attention to them. We want to be part of their lives. And that's what mentoring is. Just think of the folks that mentored you. I'm still in contact with people that mentored me 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's really important because we built such a solid relationship. Now I'm using some of the tools that they use for me to mentor other people and other students. There are different forms of multicultural societies. There's a pluralistic and there's a particularistic. We want to make sure that the society that we're involved with, the society that we have, is pluralistic. And that means that everybody's culture counts, everybody's background counts. Particularistic, what they used to call ethnocentrism, means my culture is better than your culture. And that just is causing friction. You know, we're getting involved with that right now. Just look at the politics, look at the streets, look at the groups that are actually forming. My culture is better than your culture. I need to stand up for it instead of standing up for everybody in a pluralistic society. A pluralistic society says everybody has something to contribute, and we're going to make sure that we understand what those contributions are. But then we also have to understand that there's a public domain and a private domain. Within the public domain, we all live under the same rules, the same regulations. We all go about things in the same way. We may put different effort into it. We may take it in a different approach, but in the public domain, that means that we have equality of opportunities. In the private domain, people can do whatever they want. They can speak different languages. They have different family structures, whatever it happens to be, but that's their own private domain. Public domain and private domain are very, very different. And we need to make sure we understand that. We also have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to treat our students with respect and dignity. We have a responsibility to make sure we're doing everything in our power to make sure that they're successful. But then we have a responsibility, two words. We have to have the ability to respond to them in a certain way, in an appropriate way, in a respectful way. We have to have that ability as well. It's not just understanding what our responsibilities are, it's making sure that we can take those responsibilities and respond to them in a way that's going to be effective. I have people tell me all the time, well, I'm colorblind. And I just kind of laugh at it. You know, how could you not see somebody's color? And what they mean is it doesn't mean anything to them, that I'm not going to put any barriers up simply because of people's color. And that's fine. But maybe it means something not to the person that's saying it, maybe it means something to the person that's in front of them. We should not be colorblind. We should be color conscious. We should be aware of it. But once again, don't set up any barriers. Don't put up any disadvantages. Just make sure that we understand that it does mean something to some people. For some people, that's their primary identity. So when we say we're colorblind, we don't see color, all of a sudden, we took their identity away from them. We have absolutely no right to take their identity away from anybody. So we should not be colorblind. We should be color conscious. We should be aware of it. We should make sure we understand it. We should make sure that we're learning from it. We should make sure that we're giving people the ability to be who they want to be, and more importantly, to define themselves for themselves. And very oftentimes we don't do this. We make assumptions. We put people in boxes. We want to make sure that, oh, we think you're this and we think you're that. Let those students that you're mentoring define them. Let them define themselves. And everybody's going to define themselves differently. I have 4 children. I'm Black and Italian. My ex-wife is Irish, English, and French Canadian. So I've got biracial, multiracial children. And I've got 4 of them, and they all define themselves differently. And I'm perfectly fine with that because it's their choice. It's not my choice. So make sure you give your students the opportunity to do so. This is what we always do. We talk about race, we talk about ethnicity, we talk about gender and age, like those are the only identities. Like that's what multiculturalism and inclusion are all about. Look at all the things on the bottom of that. And not just think about your students, but think about the people that are also mentoring, the mentors that you have relationship with, your colleagues, in other words. There's so many different ways that people identify themselves, and not just us as adults, but kids as well. Kids identify themselves in a variety of different ways. We want to make sure we understand what those ways are because that's how we relate to them. That's how we build relationships with them. It's not always about those things on the top of the iceberg. It's about the things that are beneath the surface, the things that we don't talk about, the things that we simply sometimes just ignore, to be quite honest with you, or sometimes we ignore them because we don't understand them. We've got to make sure that we're open enough to see all of those identities because everybody is intersectional. Everybody is. And this is a definition of what intersectionality is. It's a combination of all these identities. Sometimes I'm a father, sometimes I'm a grandfather, sometimes I'm a husband, sometimes I'm an educator, sometimes I'm just Blane Harding sports nut. We all have these identities that we go through. Kids have these identities that they go through as well. And given the situation that they're in, given the audience that they're actually around, different identities will surface at different times. And we want to make sure that we understand that. Perfect example. African-American student in college outside of the classroom may strongly identify as a Black student. Inside the classroom, he doesn't want to identify that way because he doesn't want to be isolated, doesn't want to be, set aside. He just wants to identify as another student in that class. Doesn't have to have that special identity because the situation dictates which identity comes to the surface. So we have to make sure we understand that. We have to make sure that everybody, and I don't care who you are, I don't care where you've been raised, I don't care how old you are, everybody has these identities. Everybody has intersectionality. Everybody has a combination. And I think it's important that we do that. You know, we become a society of raceaholics where race trumps everything else, and it shouldn't trump everything else. We've got to make sure that it doesn't trump everything else. Because when it does, then we wipe out people's identities. Then we dismiss people's identities. And then we don't even recognize people's identities. Sometimes we don't even recognize their primary identity because we're making assumptions of what identities actually are. So I want you all to take a look at this chart. And I'm just going to give you a couple minutes to read that. When I ask people where they are in terms of their cultural effectiveness, I get a variety of answers. I'm there, I'm almost there, I'm trying, I haven't quite gotten it yet. None of those satisfy me when I ask that question. So I put together this chart so you can clearly identify where you're at. Are you at the non-awareness where you don't see diversity anything but diversity? Are you at acceptance where you realize that difference is not deviant, but you really don't understand how to actually leverage that? Those first three, the non-awareness, the awareness, and the acceptance, are knowledge, they're thought. There's no action in any of those. Once you get to understanding and adaptation and skillfulness, that's where the action becomes really important. That's where you take the knowledge that you've gained and you're able to leverage it in the situations you find yourself in. And it's really important for you to understand where you're at. You may be at awareness of difference and you're really comfortable at adaptation. That's totally up to you. Not everybody wants to get to intercultural skillfulness, and I understand that. You need to find out where you're at, and then you need to find out where you're comfortable, and then you need to make a plan. I can't make you do it. Monica can't make you do it. Your mentees can't make you do it. It's up to you, if you think this is important, to do what's necessary for you to increase your cultural effectiveness, increase your knowledge about others that are different than yourselves. And if you notice on that last one, I don't talk about stepping outside your comfort zone because I don't really firmly believe in stepping outside your comfort zone because I know at the end of the day, people step back in. What I'm really talking about is expanding your comfort zone. Expand that comfort zone so you're comfortable around anybody and everybody, whether you realize what their identity is or not, because that's how you learn. That's how you grow. That's how you build relationships. You shouldn't just be building it with people you're comfortable with. You should be building it with the people that are around you, whether you know their identities. It's part of learning. Asking questions is part of understanding. So there's a variety of different ways that you can move, and I'll just give you a few examples, but you've got to come up with your own way to do it. You can invite somebody different than you to lunch. I think that's a perfect way, or even to coffee and have a conversation. You're not only learning, but they're learning. You should take on mentees that are different identities than you have. So you're learning from them and they're learning from you. It gets rid of a lot of those stereotypes. It gets rid of a lot of those fears that we have. It gets rid of a lot of those things that are keeping us from actually building those strong relationships. You can read, you can travel, go to somebody else's institutional structure. When I taught at Colorado State, that was part of the class that I taught, I made sure that they picked out an institutional structure that they would go to. And if you're a culture in the United States and you don't have an institutional structure, your culture is not going to last. It's an institutional structure that allows it to last. For example, within the Black community, there's two main institutional structures. The Black church that everybody knows about, and this one you might think it's a little funny, but it's just as strong as the Black church, and that's the barbershop. You go to a Black barbershop, you will learn about the Black community. People go there and talk. People go there not just to get a haircut, they go there to socialize. They go there to meet other people. They go there to talk about education and their family and sports and what's happening in their community and everything. Every single group has an institutional structure. And when you go to a church, for example, some of my students used to pick churches to go to. They come back to class and then they talk about it. And I said, what happened? Well, they embraced me. They wanted to know about me. They talked about me. They wanted to know about my background. They shared with me. They were happy I was there in their church. I'm not telling anybody to change their religion or the denominations, but get to know people that are different than yourselves. Put yourself in positions that you normally would not put yourself in, and that's how you're going to be effective. That's how change is going to happen. Change isn't going to happen just because you want it to. Change isn't going to happen just because you read something in a book or online. You have to have actionable items. You've got to get yourself out there. Once again, you have to become comfortable being uncomfortable, and you've got to allow yourself to make mistakes. And that's why some people don't do it. They're so afraid of making mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes, and I've been doing this, as I said, for over 30 years. We're going to make mistakes. Give yourself some leeway. Give yourself some grace. Don't beat yourself up because you made mistakes. Learn from the mistakes that you actually made. And everybody's going to do it. I used to be the graduation announcer at Colorado State University. I know that you do not touch Muslim women because I taught about that in my classes. There was a Muslim woman I worked with for 10 years, and I didn't think she was ever going to graduate. They handed me the cards, and I'm just reading the cards and minding my own business and not really looking at the students as they go because I wanted to get their names right. She handed me the card. I couldn't believe she was graduating. I dropped the card. I gave her a huge bear hug. Her family came here all the way from Saudi Arabia in the front row to watch her graduate. I knew I made a mistake. I stepped back and I said, I'm so sorry that I did that. She looked at me and she said, don't worry about it, Blane. And she walked across the stage. If I didn't have that relationship with her, I never would have been able to do that. It would have been a big scene with her parents and with her during that graduation. But she understood where I was coming from. She understood that I did everything I could to try and help her out. She understood that we had a solid relationship. I'm not quite sure how her parents took it because I didn't talk about them afterwards, but I knew that she understood it. She let me make that mistake because I had a solid relationship with her. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to ask questions. You are in a position of power and privilege, whether you realize it or not. And what that means to you and what that means to me, hopefully is the same thing, that you have to perform at a higher level. You're not just a mentor, you are a role model. You are a role model for the students that you're serving. You're also a role model for your colleagues that are mentoring other students. And ask yourself this, if not you, then who? If you're not going to do these things, if you're not going to try and instill them, then why are you a mentor? You're not just a mentor to make sure they're academically successful. You're a mentor to make sure that they are socially successful, they're culturally successful, they're successful in growing into really solid citizens. That's what mentoring is about. Mentoring is not one-dimensional. You can't just tell me, oh, I'm a mentor, then I'm going to do math. I'm a mentor and I'm going to do biology. It doesn't work that way. Because if you don't have that relationship with the students, it doesn't matter how much you know that subject matter, because you are teaching them other things as well. So simply ask yourself that question. If not me, then who? And you need to make sure that you're fully vested in what you're doing and the obligations that you have. Because the more space you create for individuals to explore the identities, the more identities will emerge from that space. In other words, if they are really comfortable with you, their identities are going to come out. If they're really comfortable with you, they're going to be able to be the people that they are. Not the people that you want them to be, but the people that they are. And so many students don't have the obligation to do that. There's so much peer pressure out there that sometimes they're really stuck in this little box and they can't really be who they're going to be. They can't really be who they want to be because they can't express it that way. But if we can create the space, and we can create, and I hate to use the word, but a safe space for them, especially with the relationships that they have with you, they can become who they want to be. They can show you who they actually are and not who they think people want them to be, the assumptions that people make about them. So we need to make sure that the spaces that we're creating are the spaces that are needed for their identities to emerge. And I guarantee you, if that is a safe space, if that's a comfortable space, you will be surprised some of the identities that emerge. You will be surprised at some of the conversations that you have with your mentees. They will open up to you. They will trust you. You will have credibility. All the things that are necessary to build strong relationships, you will have by creating that space. They will understand that you care. They will understand that you're vested. They will understand that you have their best interest in mind, and that is extremely important in becoming a successful mentor. This is what I mean by power and privilege. All of these aspects. And it's kind of interesting when we talk about it. I generally don't talk about power and privilege, but I thought I had to in terms of this presentation because mentors do have power and mentors do have privilege. Because when people usually talk about power and privilege, especially when they talk about privilege, they really are limited. They usually talk about white privilege and what white privilege is. And I'm not talking about white privilege. I'm talking about privilege for all of your identities. You know, I've talked to students of color that think they don't have privilege because all they've ever heard about is white privilege. I've talked to gay people, LGBTQ, that don't think they have privilege because all they talk about is white privilege. And I'm tired of them doing that because that lessens their opportunities. It lessens their opportunities to do things. It lessens their sense of worth. It lessens their sense of having any form of power or even any form of influence. And there's a difference between power and influence. Power is the ability to do, and influence is the ability to sway. So we want to make sure that they understand, no matter what age they are, that they do have power and privilege, especially that privilege part. We want to make sure that they understand that, because if they're not developing it at a young age and they're not using it in a positive way, then they're not going to use it as a positive way as they move through school and as they get older. You can use privilege in three different ways. You can use privilege to your own advantage, you can use privilege to somebody else's disadvantage, or you can use your privilege to help other people out. As mentors, that's exactly what you're doing. You are using your privilege in every aspect of your privilege to make sure the students that you're serving are successful. You're using it in a very positive way. And just because you're doing that, that doesn't mean you're losing anything. It's not a zero-sum equation. You can use your privilege to other people's advantage without giving up anything. So what I've done to the students that I've talked to, I designed this. And there's dominant and subordinate groups. And when students tell me, no matter what age they are, I don't have any privilege, especially college kids. I mean, telling me all the time I have no privilege. We actually make this chart. And it under dominant and subordinate, when I first bring it up to the students, it's blank. I have them define it. And this is generally how they define those. One that you might not be familiar with is gender, cisgender, and transgender. Gender is different than sex. Sex is male and female. Cisgender means you're born with male parts and you identify as being a male, or you're born with female parts and you identify as being a female. The rest of those I think are quite obvious. And then once students have this, I pull up the blank chart again. I have them put an X where their identities are. And you can do this as well. And I think it's important that you do this as mentors so you understand where your privilege is. What you're going to find out, and I guarantee you the vast majority of you, I would guess 90-something% of you, have more X's under the dominant than you have under the subordinate. Students of color have more X's under the dominant than they have under the subordinate. So the real question is, okay, now you know that as a male in society, you have a dominant characteristic. As a straight person in society, you have a dominant characteristic. As a Christian in society, you have a dominant characteristic. As a native born, you have a dominant characteristic. The question becomes, what are you going to do with it? How can you use that to help other people out? As a male, I can stand up for females. As somebody who's able-bodied, I can make sure that people that are not able-bodied are not discriminated against. I have the ability to do that if I recognize that that's my privilege. I have the ability as a native born to have so many different opportunities to educate, so many different opportunities to help out. All of you can do the same thing. All of you need to do that. Use the privilege that you have to help others out. Use the privilege that you have that translates into either power or influence to help other people out. You will not lose anything. As a matter of fact, you will gain a lot from that. Mere satisfaction in the fact that you're contributing is enough for me to make sure I do those things. So you have to make sure you're doing the things that are necessary for people to actually be successful. We get into the bias section now. This is really interesting. It says, if you ask me to name the greatest discoveries in the past 50 years, along with things like the internet and the Higgs particle, and I have absolutely no idea what the Higgs particle is, I would include the discovery of unconscious biases. We all have unconscious biases. And sometimes they lead to exactly what it says, to stereotypes about gender, race, and sexual orientation, also to microaggressions, to inequality, to a lack of understanding of what equality and equity are, into an unequal justice in society. Everybody has bias. Everybody. I have bias. Everybody has bias. It's just a matter of willingness to admit that you have bias. Because one thing we do not want to happen is that we don't recognize our bias and our bias gets in the way of us mentoring students. Because we have this assumption about them, we have this stereotype about them, or we have this lack of knowledge about them. Because the lack of knowledge about them and trying to go about our job is just as bad as having a stereotype about them. And in order to be culturally effective, in order to say that you have multicultural awareness, knowledge, and skills, you've got to understand what your biases are. It's a given. You have to become aware of your own biases, but then you also have to be skilled at controlling them. I've been to a number of presentations from professionals around the country. The last one I went to was from an expert from California that talked about bias. and talked about unconscious bias. Now universities have actually gone to, you have to do unconscious bias training in order to be on a search committee. So I asked him, how long does that last? We recognize it. We recognize it in October. How long does it last? He said, maybe 3 or 4 months. It'll come back. If you're not constantly checking it, if you're not constantly asking your questions, it will come back. And you probably won't even know that it comes back. So you've got to make sure that you're skilled enough to control it. You've got to make sure that it does not, and I mean does not, get in the way of your values. It's probably not possible to get rid of all of our biases. As a matter of fact, I would actually say it's not possible at all to get rid of all of our biases. But we want to make sure that we slow it down enough that it does not betray our values. It does not get in the way of us doing what we're volunteering to do. It does not get in the way of us serving as mentors, as us serving as role models, is us doing the best job we can with the students that we're actually serving. But if you don't check your biases, if you're not aware of them, they will get in the way, I guarantee it. And some people they just have this fear. I don't want to know what my biases are. Or a lot of people are embarrassed. And you don't have to admit your biases to anybody else. Keep them to yourself, but make sure you check them, make sure you control them. But there's an embarrassment there. All of a sudden you realize, I've got this stereotype in my mind. I've got this bias that I've actually been living with. I don't want anybody to know that because they'll consider me to be a bad person. No, you're not. Anybody's going to have biases. If you don't check them and you use those biases in a negative way, then you probably are a bad person because you haven't taken the time to understand who you are and understand where you're coming from and understand how you yourself was socialized. We're not born with these biases. We are socialized with these biases. So once again, make sure you control them so they do not betray your values. Make sure you control them so they don't get in the way of you being effective with the students that you're actually serving. Because that's what you need to do. You need to make sure that you understand it. And what goes hand in hand with biases are microaggressions. And before I show you a definition of that, I have to say that microaggressions, for the most part, are unintentional. The people don't mean to say the things that they say in a negative way. They just don't understand. We all understand how important language is and how critical language is to everything that we do. But these are kind of slights. They communicate hostile, derogatory, and negative insults. And we hear it all the time. Calling kids nowadays, colored kids. I hear that all the time from older people at the university because that's part of their generation and they really haven't moved forward in terms of the language that they're using. And they don't even realize that that's a slight. When I bring it to their attention, they say the same thing. Well, that's what my generation says. But you're not referring to your generation. You're referring to the generation that is in front of you. What does their generation say? You no longer call people Orientals because Oriental is a rug and it's a food. And Orient actually means East. East of what? East of Europe, because Europe is the center of the universe. That's where the term comes from. That's why they're Orientals. They are not. They are Asian Americans or Pacific Islanders. Even the naming process becomes important. Even the naming process has microaggressions in them. I've done a number of presentations in my career. And people will come up to me after the presentations. For the longest time, I'm thinking, wow, that's a fantastic compliment. Thank you very much. And they would say, oh my God, I can't believe how articulate you are. And I'm thinking, okay, that's great. I really appreciate that. I began to ask my white colleagues. They were also doing presentations that I know are really good public speakers. Has anybody ever said that to you? And they looked at me really oddly and say, no, nobody's ever said that to me. Why are they saying it to me? Because they have a difficult time because of stereotypes, believing that I could actually be articulate. And it sounds really goofy, it sounds really simple, but why aren't they saying that to my white colleagues? Why aren't they telling them that, oh my God, I'm so surprised you're so articulate? They'll go up and say, great speech, I really appreciate it, but they never use that terminology. And I've heard it dozens of times in my career. And I've kind of brushed over it now, but I mean, it's a microaggression. And they're not doing it to be mean. They're not doing it in spite. They're doing it because they think it's a compliment. So in other words, they're unintentional. But just like we're checking our biases, just like we're making sure that we understand them, we also have to understand our microaggressions. We also have to understand where that's coming from. We also have to understand the language that we're using. I've been fighting for the longest time in every university I've been at to get rid of the concept of at-risk students. How would you feel if somebody came up to you and said, hey, I know you're an at-risk student and we got this fantastic program for you. I know you're an at-risk student and I'm going to mentor you. You already told that student that not many people have faith in you. You are at risk, you've got a high propensity that you're going to fail, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that you don't. Instead of telling them that they're at risk, why don't you tell them it's at potential? I am here to make sure that you reach your full potential, like everybody else can reach their full potential. Language is so, so important, but sometimes we don't even think about it. Sometimes we just automatically, our first response is to give an answer, not to think about whether or not the question is valid. You know, I talk about slogans all the time. And I was doing a presentation to a group of students this past Thursday. And there were about 60 students on a Zoom meeting, and I asked them a really simple question. How many of you think the glass is half full? How many of you think the glass is half empty? When I just asked that question, what is your initial response? Of course, your initial response is to answer it. Well, let me think. I think it's half empty. The other group saying, no, I think it's half full. And when they said that, I said, you're both wrong. And one student just piped up and said, how can we both be wrong? It's either half empty or half full. I said, no, it's not. It's refillable. Very different way of looking at it, and a very optimistic way of looking at it. If it's half empty, you can refill it. If it's half full, you can refill it, but you don't have to actually answer every single question the way it's asked. Think about it. Think about language. Think about how you're going to respond to it, just like you have to think about how you're going to respond to your students. So biases, microaggression, stereotypes all go hand in hand. They shouldn't get in the way of you doing your job. They shouldn't get in the way of you being as effective as you possibly could be with those that you're actually serving. There is a huge difference between equality and equity. For me, as mentors, what you are pushing for is not equality. And I know for some of you that may sound really strange, that may sound really odd, but you cannot have equality until you have equity. Equality is sameness. Equity is fairness. How can you have sameness if everybody doesn't have the same tools? How can you have sameness if everybody doesn't have the same opportunities? How can you have sameness if everybody doesn't have the same educational background as you? You can't. You've got to have equity first, because equity is that fairness. You give people what they need in order to be successful. If any of you have more than one child, I'm sure you're treating your kids equally. I would almost guarantee you're treating your kids equally. If you're going to treat your kids equally, you don't treat them the same, you treat them differently. You treat them differently because they're individuals and they need different things. I've got twin boys that are 26. Kyle needs different things than Christopher needs. I'm treating them equally by treating them differently, by giving them what they need when they need it. That's called equity. That's called fairness. One of my former colleagues at the University of Kansas used to define it this way. Equality is giving everybody a pair of shoes. Equity is giving everybody a pair of shoes that fit. Give them what they need, give them what fits them, and they will be successful. But once again, we're not shooting for equality. Equality will come if we have equity. If we have fairness and we have support and we have the opportunity to give those students what they need in order to be successful, that will actually follow suit. You will have that. They will have equality. And people always misunderstand this. Well, we have to have equality. How can you have equality if everybody's not starting it? What's the old saying? That everybody's not starting at the same point in a race. Some people have a 10-yard head start. That's not equality. That's not equality at all. So we've got to make sure that we understand these concepts. Building relationships. I'm sure you all understand that teamwork is really important. And I'm talking about not only building relationships with your mentees, but I'm also talking about building relationships with the people that are also serving as mentors, because you can learn from them. They're going to encounter situations that you probably haven't encountered yet, but it's probably going to come down the road. Talk to people, share with people, build partnerships and relationships with those people that are also serving as mentors so you can learn from them. You can understand that so you don't make those same mistakes, or you have an understanding of how you can actually go about it. Even if you've never been involved in a situation like that, you can learn from them because these situations are going to arise. So when you have a partnership and you have a relationship, either with your colleagues or especially with your students, we can talk about a variety of different things that are part of relationships. But the number one thing in any relationship that you're going to form is that you have mutually agreed upon visions and goals. If you don't have mutually agreed upon visions and goals, then you're both shooting for different things. Then you're probably not going to be successful. And then you're going to judge students as not being successful, or students are going to judge you as not being successful because you didn't help them to reach their goal. Conversations, talk to them, find out what they want, find out what their goals are. And they're going to change over time. Of course, they're going to change over time. But unless we begin to think of them at a young age, and unless we begin to actually put them out there, we're never going to achieve them. So make sure you understand that we also have to have mutually agreed upon goals and visions. And have that conversation. It's a continual conversation. It's kind of like culture. Culture is dynamic. The culture of 20 years ago is not the culture of today, will not be the culture of tomorrow. Just like that, their visions and goals are going to change as well, especially if they're younger. But if they don't start to think about it, if they don't start to vision it, How are they supposed to make it happen? So we've got to make sure we understand that. We have to appreciate everybody's work. I talk to people all the time, and somebody will go to their office and say, John Smith was fantastic. He actually helped me. And if he wasn't for him, share that. Would you like people to do that? Wouldn't you like people to get a hold of you and say, somebody was talking about you and they were raving about the things that you did? We want the recognition, whether we admit it or not. We have to appreciate others' work, and we've got to make sure we understand others' work. That's part of building those relationships. If somebody's successful, let them know they're successful. If a student's successful or another student comes to them and says something, let that mentor know that they said something about them. Everybody wants those kudos. Everybody wants that recognition. Let's give it to them. Ongoing communication. You've got to have ongoing communication. And I'm talking about real communication. I'm not talking about you talking to your mentees and telling them what to do and following up to make sure that they did it. That's not communication. Communication is two ways. It's both ways. If they're not talking and just you're talking, it's not communication. You both have to be talking in order for it to be ongoing communication. And ongoing communication goes back up to that number one, mutually agreed upon visions and goals. Because as they change, that communication is going to change. That communication is going to become more specific, or it's going to change up completely into another area. So you want to make sure that communication is going. If you're married, you understand what I'm talking about. Communication is key, and it's got to be ongoing, and it's got to be both ways. It has to be both ways. Value, solicit, and learn from others. And I'm not just talking about your colleagues, I'm talking about the students that you're serving. Value, solicit, and learn from them. They have something to teach you. I guarantee you. I'm 63. If I had to tutor somebody that was 15 or 16, I'd have a whole lot to learn because I don't understand 15 and 16-year-old culture. I don't understand what they're going through in 2020. I have an idea. I see what's out there. I read and I'm in the media and I see all these news reports. But in terms of what they're going through personally, in terms of what they're going through in their communities, I need to make sure I learn from them. I need to make sure I value them. I need to make sure I solicit information from them, because if you don't solicit that information, they're going to hold back because they don't think you care. They don't think you want to hear that. They don't think it's important. They don't think it's going to matter. It's going to matter. It's going to matter in every single thing that you do. So make sure that you do that. Create shared, inclusive making decisions. Don't make all the decisions for your mentees. There are some decisions you have to make. There's decisions that they're not aware of. But make sure that you do make those type of decisions. You explain to them why. Other decisions, it's got to be shared. It's got to be inclusive. It's got to be. And you've got to make sure you utilize reciprocal learning. Those are the things that build strong relationships, along with this next slide. I think that one's a given. Respect, trust, and mutual understanding. I'd throw in credibility there as well. But if you don't have respect and you don't have trust, why would they listen to you? And if you don't have respect and trust for them, why should you listen to them? And you've got to make sure you understand that. It's got to go both ways. And once again, that's conversation, that's discussion, that's communication, so that they understand what's going on. You can't just tell somebody what to do if it has no meaning to them. Develop beliefs that all contribute to the organization, community, institution. I think that specifically goes towards your colleagues and making sure that everybody has a contribution, making sure that everybody can learn from everybody. You're in this together. I think Ben Franklin once said, how did he put it? If we don't hang together, then we're going to hang separately. Hang together, support each other, make sure you know what's going on, share your resources, celebrate accomplishments, constantly advocate for one another, and challenge institutional structures and organizational structures when they need to be challenged. And if it's not challenged, then question it. There are a lot of things that are part of organizations and part of institutions that get in the way of student success. And sometimes they're there because they've always been there. They're dinosaurs. And sometimes they're there because they're antiquated. And sometimes they're there because people don't understand that this is a new generation and a different generation. But challenge it, identify it and challenge it. Ask questions as to why it exists. Demonstrate that it might be a barrier for student success. Demonstrate it might be a barrier for mentoring success. We want to make sure that we have the best structures possible in order for our students to be successful. And I think that's important. Love this slide. Absolutely love it. I've had so many people that I don't know why they can't find it on their own, but they ask me to send it to them because I put it in so many different presentations over the past few months. Take care of your thoughts when you're alone. Take care of your words when you're with people. The first one is your thoughts. And your thoughts are your thoughts. And if you've got negative thoughts, you've got negative thoughts, that's in your head. Make sure that does not manifest itself in the relationship with your students. and take care of those words with your other people. Just like I said earlier, language is so important. Language is so crucial and critical to the things that we do. We want to make sure we're doing things in a positive way. Your thoughts and your words are important. And hopefully, your thoughts and your words mesh, because sometimes they don't. Sometimes we have these negative thoughts. Those negative thoughts should never translate into language you're using with your mentees. It should never translate into language you're using with your colleagues. So make sure you understand that. Take care of those thoughts when you're alone. Take care of your words with other people. That's become my second favorite saying. The first saying I don't have on a slide, but I'll let you all know what it is. It's not the figment of the pigment. It's the enigma of the stigma. Think about that for a second. It's not the figment of the pigment. It's the enigma of the stigma. It's not because of the color of people's skins. It's because we put so much loaded barriers. We put so much of a stigma on them that they can't be successful. Don't let that get in your way either. But once again, this is what it's about. It's all about respect. It's all about the respect that we give. It's all about the respect that we receive. And respect, once again, is not only got to be gained, it's got to be maintained. And we've got to maintain that respect over time. We maintain it by how we treat students. We maintain it by how we role model. We maintain it by how we carry ourselves and how we talk to students. Now, the things that we do, that's how we maintain that respect. And we've got to make sure that we understand that. So I really appreciate the opportunity. On that very last slide, and I'm going to send this to Monica so everybody has it. That's my contact information, BlaneHarding22@gmail.com. I want you to make sure you understand that you can contact me at any time. And I'm more than happy to help you out. I'm more than happy to answer any of your questions. If you want some additional readings, I'd be more than happy to suggest some readings for you. But I really, once again, have to thank you from the bottom of my heart. The job that you're doing and the responsibility that you're taking on is immense. And I know it's immense. And I know that you're going to be good at it. I know that you're going to be successful. And I know your students are going to be successful. So take care, work really hard, do the best job that you can. And I guarantee you 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, you're going to hear back from those students. I hear back from students and it always just blows me away. Oh, Blane, I haven't talked to you in the past 10 years. One student actually posted the notes from my class from 1983 on Facebook and said, I remember this. And I was digging through my boxes and I saw this and I thought about you and I told people, I mean, it was just, my head was this big. I was going, wow. And I really have that much of an impact on that student. You are going to have an immense impact on the students that you're serving. And once again, thank you all very, very much. Take care and be safe.